Well, I'm so excited to be here with all of you today to discuss inclusive citing practices. I'm really excited to have Dr. Dulce Westberg, Dr. Michael Kraus, and Dr. Reem Saab with us to discuss what inclusive citing means to you and how we can kind of improve inclusive citing practices in social personality psychology. So to kick things off in our conversation, what does inclusive citing mean to you, and why do you think it's important to engage in inclusive citation practices? Michael, would you like to start us off?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so citations, right? I think back to my undergrad education and like how did you get taught? Like try to think back to that. How were you taught about citations? It's really important to follow APA style. And then I think beyond that, there's this just kind of assumption that there's one appropriate cite and for each point. And so you're gonna find it over the course of your studies, and then that's gonna be that. And then probably if you go further into your career, you start to understand a little bit more of the social process of citing, right? You're thinking about things like, did the authors publish in the journal that I published in? Um, is the journal that this citation from, is it high status? Are the authors high status? Is the author mean in their reviews of other people's work? And should I include their citations because that's going to impact where my paper gets published? Um, is this citation within my discipline? And then does this citation maybe connect me to the kinds of people that I want to be connected to, right? So all of these choices reveal how citation practices are fundamentally social. So, one of the things that we learn, I think, in our disciplines and studying inequalities just more broadly is that if something is social, then it borrows from the social fabric of our society. And so, um, if citation is social and you're not highlighting that piece of it, you're likely to engage in citation practices that are narrowly focused on maybe your discipline, maybe focused on high prestige journals with impact factors and high status authors. That's going to leave people out. So when I think about inclusive citing and why it's important to engage in, I think about how, as we are producing science in this fundamentally social process, it's important to think about the science in its fullest extent, capturing human experience. And to that extent, it must be more inclusive than just, is this a high status journal? Is this in my discipline? Are these authors from the right universities and the like? And so, being intentional about broadening who you include in citations is fundamental to a fuller, more complete understanding of psychology and human experience. So that's what it means to me, at least.
Um, yeah, I think I can maybe add a little bit more to what it means for me. So I think from my perspective, if we want to try to understand what inclusive citation practices mean, we need to also think of what exclusionary citations mean and what they imply. So citations that tend to exclude scholarship from members of historically and continuously marginalized groups. In my mind, exclusionary citation practices basically imply that not all social groups' knowledge is valued. Not all social groups deserve to be listened to. Not all social groups are allowed to have voice within psychology, and that it's basically okay to ignore and erase the labor and contributions from scholars belonging to particular social groups to the field of psychology. And basically, these exclusionary citation practices imply that the scholarship that is worth considering and that is worth learning from to develop our discipline is the scholarship that tends to be produced by white, Western, heterosexual, able-bodied men that work in specific countries and work in specific institutions in the world. And recently, I was reading an article that I really enjoyed that in some parts was talking about exclusionary citation practices, and it's an article by Geeta Reddy and Amina Amir in the British Journal of Social Psychology. And in talking about the exclusionary citation practices, they basically say, I will quote, "Some voices speak louder and reverberate for longer than others, forming what we and other scholars have named hegemonic white stream psychology," unquote. So I really like how they frame this. And I think the result of this is that our discipline in its mainstream ends up reproducing existing social structures, which are inequitable and unfair, that are, structures that are classist, imperialist, sexist, racist, heteronormative, ableist, and so on. And I think what's really important for us to also realize is that we should expect this to happen once we recognize that the discipline of psychology as a labor institution is not operating outside of society. So we are inevitably shaped by the existing social structures around us. And the exclusionary citation practices are just one example of the ways that these unfair hierarchies get reproduced and maintained in our discipline. And I think finally, one point I would really like to make is that it's important to realize that exclusionary citation practices are not just a problem of equity or of justice, but they're also a problem of the scientific validity of our discipline. Because if our discipline continues to exclude the knowledge produced by certain social groups, if our discipline is governed by systems that obstruct the production, the publication, the dissemination, accessibility of knowledge produced by certain social groups, then we are producing a psychological science that fails to be a science that is by all and for all. And I think for many of us, this goes fundamentally against what we believe our science should be doing. So I think from my perspective, when we are trying to contest exclusionary citation practices, we are not only seeking to challenge existing social hierarchies to produce a more inclusive science, but also to produce a science that is more valid, more applicable, more relevant to social groups from around the world.
I completely agree with these points. And I guess I would just add that I also view inclusive citation practices as a technical skill that we all need to kind of contribute time and effort into learning to do better, and to engage really critically and thoughtfully with the work of scholars that are often underrepresented within our reference list. And as Reem was saying, that this will really contribute to a science that can include all voices and not just the privileged few voices that perhaps are in our top mainstream outlets that often don't privilege conceptual linkages that the work of underrepresented scholars typically does. And so we're only getting one vantage of science as opposed to a more cumulative and representative science. And so I would say that kind of this technical skill involves being very intentional about what work you're engaging with, why you're engaging with it, and what it really says about your overall argument. And that building this as a skill, I think, also helps students to better understand how they can change those cultural norms within the field. That yes, it is a skill, and that sometimes the way that we're engaging with inclusive citing is, or I guess exclusionary citing rather, is sort of invisible, that we don't really see it as something that we're intentionally doing. Oh, I'm only engaging with the work of the people I know or the work that is relevant. I'm trying to produce good science. While that might be true, producing good science involves maybe going outside of your comfort zone, questioning your biases and what work you're engaging with and why you're engaging with it. To really grow that muscle of understanding how can I better engage in these practices and kind of represent all scholars as opposed to only some.
Thank you all so much for those responses of what both inclusive and exclusionary citing means to you. I do really agree that it's important to make that comparison to understand each of them. So moving on to our second question, which is related to what Dulce was just talking about how you incorporate inclusive citing practices in your own work, and maybe some strategies that you might recommend for others to try if they're interested in increasing the inclusiveness of their citing practices. And Dulce, do you want to start us off?
Yes, definitely. I would say that one of the most important ways that I feel I try and engage in inclusive citation practices is to really be thoughtful and reflective about what work I'm engaging with and how it impacts my thinking about certain arguments. And through doing this, I hope that I can reduce epistemic exclusion within the field and improve the inclusivity of our science and overall kind of the credibility of our science. And this really involves also being intentional about promoting the work of historically excluded researchers. One way I might recommend doing this is to intentionally engage with community curated databases that really have the work of BIPOC scholars represented, even kind of in your lab meetings, making it a project to sort of go through these databases and see what work is relevant to the research that you're doing, I think is a cool exercise to try and stretch the bounds of how do we typically think about this work? What are adjacent topics saying about this work? Looking beyond the top journals in our field, looking beyond institutional prestige, and going into what do others really have to say that are doing related work on these topics, but maybe not exactly what I'm doing. I do a lot of research on diversity and personality and identity using narrative methods, for example. So I often look into the work of ethnic studies, women's studies, intersectionality, critical race theory, sociology, and these papers often have things that I don't always think about as a psychologist. Psychology can be fairly homogenous as well in terms of racial ethnic diversity and also representation of women scholars. And so it's nice to look outside of the field to get the representation of those perspectives that we might be seeking. This also is related to a point on citing more broadly within psychology. So this means, again, promoting those conceptual links outside of psychology, trying to kind of really engage with international research and the work of women of color as well to combat these more intersectional disadvantages. We also know, again, that we tend to cite the people that are kind of in our social network. So I would say it's kind of important to, or very important to, provide access to individuals who are historically underrepresented in psychology, even within your professional networks, because providing access to those individuals will also elevate their name and their voice within psychology so that they're more likely to be cited. And so these inequities aren't further perpetuated through these professional spaces. Another exercise that I think is helpful is a citational diversity statement. This allows us to really critique and look into the numerical representation within our reference list, how many scholars of color are being represented, how many women scholars are being represented. And while this numeric representation is certainly not an end goal, it does give us information. It helps us to understand where are blind spots and where can we look deeper. It's not necessarily the case of let's meet this certain quota and then we've met our diversity requirement for the day. That's not really the point, I don't think, with a citational diversity statement. It's more about really thinking critically and reflectively about whose work that you're looking into, whose claims are your research really based on, and how can we sort of dig deeper into those biases and look beyond that and understand what the limitations of that really are. And I guess that kind of just relates to a final point of making sure that you're always educating yourself on these topics. This is something that's important for all of us, even those of us who do work that's really directly related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to those who really do things that are completely unrelated to some of these topics in many ways. Educating yourself on the importance of things will help you understand how it really is relevant to the work that you're doing, and that representing the voices of diverse scholars is something that is going to, again, really help the cumulativeness and credibility of our science, that in order to do good science, we have to do representative science and let all voices have a chance to contribute to that work. So I would say that's really a final point, is making sure you're training your students, that during peer review and reviews, you're sort of telling other people where they might be able to access resources related to the work of BIPOC scholars, what other things they might be able to consider in order to kind of clarify what those blind spots are in the literature.
I suppose I can jump in here. I want to just underline all those points about this being a skill set and a process, and it takes time, and being motivated to read more broadly, to broaden your network to other scholars, but other disciplines as well, where there's different ways of producing knowledge and different lenses on that knowledge, but all of that is ultimately producing a fuller picture of people's human experience. So I think that's those are really important points. What I want to, I guess, add is I think there are structures of power in the context of this kind of system of citation practices, right? So individual authors can do this, but if gatekeepers aren't playing the same game, then there are some challenges to it. So I'll talk a little bit about what editors at journals can do to sort of make this less of a challenge for authors who are maybe intentional about how they are citing. One of the things is editors can be more mindful of the real constraints on some of the generality of research that's being conducted, right? So you'll have a study on, I don't know, some perceptual phenomenon, right? But it's not qualified in any way in the title, in the abstract, in the paper itself, right? So it's meant to be perceptions of something for everybody, right? But when you dig down into the sample, right, there's a very narrow band of people who are being used in the as participants. The authors are from a narrow band of society as well, and all of this is then extrapolated to all people as if they're supposed to be a human universal, and that's the assumption that is brought into the writing process. Editors have should strongly oppose that kind of writing, in the context of editing for journals, right? Like, this is not a universal phenomenon. You are writing as if it is. You have to constrain this by talking about your sample, talking about the demographic characteristics. Would be great in psychology if people would talk about their own positions in society and the ways that it impacts, like the ways that we're talking about this research in universal terms, right? So direct pushback on editors, by editors on authors to be more, I think it's precise in terms of like who you're studying, and what the implications are and what the boundaries are to what you're studying, because it's, you see that often. There's also, citation practices that are, I think, meant to narrowly define the question, so it appears like the research appears new or appears programmatic, but you'll see citations where a single theory is being cited over and over again. Sometimes the authors happen to be authors of that theory, and so what you can do as an editor is you can say, like, this theory is about from A to B. But interestingly, there are a number of people who have also talked about A to B, right? Some of them exist within social psychology, for instance. So go ahead and have a conversation with that literature. But I bet A to B is something that it could exist in the world. And so there's other disciplines who also talk about this. And then look, there's also this research on some of the boundaries of thinking about A to B when you move outside of the United States and you move into cultural contexts where maybe capitalization is not such a central piece of organizing everything. So that kind of editorial work would assist authors in broadening how they cite. Also, it increases incentives for this skill set that we're talking about, wherein necessarily diversifying and being more inclusive about who you cite is, you're being able to see that it is really better for science more broadly.
Yeah, I can maybe also chip in here. It's been really interesting for me to reflect on this question, because I was thinking, what do inclusive citation practices mean for those of us that already operate kind of from the periphery? So in my case, I come from Lebanon, so I am from the global south. I have taught in Lebanon for many years. I continue to do research on Lebanon, the Arab region, the global south. So, and I have been based, though, in the UK the last couple of years, but still, in a sense, by necessity, my research is centered around underrepresented underrepresented groups, underrepresented regions in the world. So in that sense, does it count as, by necessity, it's more inclusive, or where are the limits of this inclusivity for those of us that are based in the global South? So for me, at the same time, as a researcher that was trained in Western institutions, my struggle has been very much about unlearning what mainstream Western psychology has taught me, when this proves to be counterproductive when I'm studying other groups, or even more marginalizing for the groups that I come from, while also trying to retain what I think is useful and helpful from mainstream Western training. And I think for me, there is a tension between, on one hand, trying to create space for voices from the Arab region in the discipline, and learning to use locally relevant approaches, producing research that adequately addresses concerns of our societies, but on the other hand, also surviving in this academic system. The tension exists because operating in a Western academia, or Westernized academia, which, as we said earlier, overvalues Eurocentric standards of knowledge production, means that if you want to adopt non-traditional approaches, this can be discouraged, and instead you are pressured to fit into the standards of set by American Eurocentric systems of knowledge production as to what constitutes good science. So for me, I think in this journey on inclusive citation practices, it's an ongoing journey of self-reflection, of growth and learning. And I now look back at some of my earlier research, and I see how it fails in various ways at challenging existing hierarchies. And in my more recent work, I am becoming better at this, at adopting kind of decolonial, anti-imperialist approaches, for example. And I would say there are various things that have helped me along the way to grow in this manner. So first off, being politically engaged in activist networks, challenging sexist, ethnocentric, imperialist, classist, racist, sectarian dynamics, that is an ongoing source of inspiration for my research and training, and the ideas and the kinds of things I become interested in reading about. And more practically, I also became involved in various projects to start reading what is produced in my region in Arabic rather than in English. So that required me to look at different kinds of databases, so outside of PsycInfo and PubMed and so on. And I'm also involved in projects that are trying to uncover the history of social psychology, for example, in our region, which will give me greater exposure to research by underrepresented scholars. I have also benefited tremendously from connecting with and learning from other social scientists, from political science and sociology, whom I have noticed are better equipped and more empowered than us psychologists in terms of producing more indigenous decolonial knowledge. I've also found it very liberating to connect with literature on decolonial psychology, and definitely found it very inspiring and energizing to connect with similarly minded psychologists from the Arab region, but also beyond, to think together, to work together, to engage in active resistance together. Also another milestone for me was an experience I had in teaching for one term at the Doha Institute for Graduate Studies in Qatar. And this institute has as its core mission the revival of social sciences in the Arab region from an indigenous perspective. So being in a space, operating in a space that has this orientation, and having the chance to teach and interact with students from various parts of the Arab region really allowed me to reflect much more deeply about our discipline, and becoming more critical of its applicability, for example, in our region. So for me, overall, I feel like it's been really important to immerse myself in networks and spaces that are actively engaged in transforming our discipline, in challenging existing power hierarchies. So yeah, these are some of the strategies that reflecting back, I have found useful in my journey.
Thank you for sharing those. And Reem, I think that we're kind of getting into, and you've touched on some of these ideas of how we might improve researcher training to foster strong and inclusive citation practices. And we've talked about kind of the overlap between, good science, robust science, strong science is representative. And so, do you have anything else to add in terms of researcher training that you haven't already mentioned?
I think I have a lot to add to this. So for me, I think we cannot hope to address the problem of exclusionary citation practices without, as Michael was earlier saying, without addressing or talking about the exclusionary social structures and systems that are shaping our world and shape academia. And these social hierarchies are built on race, class, ethnicity, gender, etc. So because these problems are structural, I don't think that there would be quick fixes for bringing about inclusive citation practices. And instead, I think that if we want to foster inclusive citation practices, we need to be engaging in ongoing long-term resistance that will take many forms, some of which we can already anticipate and some of which we don't know of yet. And they will be developed along the way. And for now, I would just like to suggest some potential steps which I think may be useful, which we can take towards producing a more equitable future in our discipline. And obviously these vary in terms of how difficult they are to implement. So to start with, I think that inclusive citation practices can be improved by obviously providing greater exposure and visibility for work from marginalized communities, and also by incentivizing the inclusion of such work in our research, as Michael was earlier also saying. So for example, if we are thinking about improving researcher training at the level of students, an important step would be the diversification of our curricula and our syllabi. So course instructors can include readings on marginalized and underrepresented groups in academia and by marginalized and underrepresented groups. And I would say also here, again, the inclusion of interdisciplinary research would be very useful. And I think course instructors can also give students exposure to marginalized community scholarship by, for example, inviting members of marginalized groups for guest lectures and as speakers at university symposia. Another useful practice would be for course instructors to build coursework in a way that encourages and incentivizes the use of research from and on marginalized communities in papers, in presentations, for example. At the same time, I think it's important to acknowledge that changing our curricula takes time, it takes effort, it's a lot of labor, and we know that many academic staff are short on these resources. So I think here it would be useful to lobby our departments, our universities, where possible, to provide the support needed for course instructors to make their syllabi more inclusive and more equitable. And I think one really important point to stress when thinking of addressing exclusionary citation practices is to realize that inclusive citation practices are not just about simply increasing representation of scholarship from marginalized and excluded groups in academia. We know, for example, that those belonging to oppressed and marginalized groups can internalize and contribute to the perpetuation of existing hierarchies, and by, for example, producing research that largely mimics white Western-centric theories and models. So in that sense, simply adding more representation from marginalized communities would not necessarily be sufficient. And instead, we want to think of including scholarship that is really aimed at challenging existing hierarchies in our discipline and existing models and theories. And the work that we would want to include should be emancipatory in its orientation. So here I would say research from indigenous psychology from various parts of the world, drawing on work from other social sciences and fields, drawing on research from the perspectives of feminist, critical, decolonial, liberation psychology scholars would be very important to consider. And I also would like to pause for a moment again and invite us to reflect and pay attention to what inclusive citation practices mean for those of us operating in the global south or outside the Anglo-Saxon world, that are publishing either in English or in our local languages. And for me, a couple of points may be worth bearing in mind here. For example, the necessity of including Indigenous work produced in local and regional languages in our teaching and in our research, but also drawing on the international literature which is produced in English. And to me, this highlights the importance of making research accessible for scholars worldwide. And it also highlights the importance of multilingual training, and the need for us as a discipline to invest really much more in the translation of research from English and to English. And another issue worth reflecting on is how knowledge production in the global south is also subject to hierarchies relating to social class, gender, ethnicity, religion. So we need to acknowledge that global south scholars themselves are often in more privileged positions than the populations they study. And in that sense, it's important for us as global south scholars to reflect on our own positionality in relation to the populations we are researching, and to reflect more broadly on whose work in the global south is reaching the international mainstream. And going back to more practical steps, I think a really important step is to incorporate training about the politics of knowledge production as a core integral part in our courses. So just like we include, for example, basics on philosophy of science in our research training, why do we not include more on the politics of knowledge production? And here I would even say accreditation bodies that evaluate our curricula should be lobbied to incentivize universities to include training on the politics of knowledge production as part of psychological curricula. And the point is that our class material should make students aware of structural issues on who produces science and for whom, and sensitize students to the inequities in our field. So that will naturally include training on exclusionary citation practices, inclusive citations, and so on. And our training, I think, must also help students gain a deeper understanding of how we are complicit in the reproduction of existing hierarchies, help students become more aware of their own privileges, their own precarities as well, and also encourage reflection on how our universities, our psychological associations, our journals, our other academic spaces help to reproduce these existing hierarchies. And here I think it's crucial that we don't just stop at simply recognizing inequities in citation practices and becoming aware of them, but also motivating students to move to a critical action and to reflect collectively on ways to contest and resist these hierarchies. For me, I think the most effective research training on inclusive citations would be one that will motivate students to engage in collective action to resist existing hierarchies, to be disruptive of the academy as it currently stands. And finally, I think just more broadly, it's important that we continue to have more and more discussions in our journals, in our conferences, our departments on underrepresented and marginalized groups in our discipline. Because ultimately, in the long term, if we want to fight exclusionary citation practices, it's necessary for scholarship from marginalized groups to become more visible, more accessible, and to take the space that it deserves. And this, it requires that we transform our psychology associations, our journals, our editorial policies, classrooms, textbooks, universities to become more inclusive and equitable towards marginalized and oppressed groups. And ultimately, this transformation requires that we reorient our existing collectives, that we create new collectives that can work together in solidarity with each other in order to challenge different kinds of oppression.
I'm happy to jump in. Because I think there's a point that Reem is making that I want to underline, and it's that like when we think about fostering more inclusive citation practices, I think often really productive conversations happen in the context of people who also care about that as a goal. They see how important it is to the field, and they're motivated to do that. The reality, though, is that our systems and structures that are in place are actually quite conservative. And so, will it be easy to change training at universities to create this kind of more inclusive, less exclusionary citation training where people are reading more broadly, citing more openly, admitting scholars to programs from marginalized groups at a higher rate, having an environment within those programs that allows those folks to matriculate to PhDs, opens up our conferences to places that don't have oppressive visa standards that don't allow people to even participate in those conferences, right? Like, so the answer to those questions is no, right? Like most often it's no, right? Like these systems are conservative by nature and hard to change because there are folks with lifetime appointments, right, who don't want that to happen. Alternative spaces, spaces that are, community spaces that are free from these kind of marginalization practices will lead the way in this, right? And so it's going to be, important for, I think, for faculty who care about these things, for graduate students who care about these things, to foster community spaces as a part of demanding training that is more inclusive, less exclusionary. That's going to be part of the process of creating and fostering strong and inclusive citation practices, demanding the kind of training that's going to open up our scholarship to a broader audience, and make possible some of the changes that are needed to really get social psychology, personality psychology out of a rut, right, and move ahead in ways that on the horizon leads to a global, fuller, more complete science.
I agree that building community around these issues is really essential, because graduate students and new incoming people into the field are going to be able to make those changes to the system, because the structures in place can only be changed by individuals building community around these topics and kind of disrupting them. And so I just really agree that training students in a way that's going to empower them to make these changes is really important. Building narratives around what it means to be an academic, what kinds of people might be included, in order to give students the, I guess, ability and desire to kind of want to make those changes, because it's not easy. It's not easy to fight against that system. It's not easy to stick with it. And then once you're an individual in power, I'd imagine it is even more complex and difficult to try and continue to change those systems, and exhausting. And so finding community not only around these topics, but also with people who share this desire to change the system is really important. Because if not, you just sort of lose momentum around it, and it becomes ever more challenging, and perhaps you feel like you just are not belonging in this space. And so it's important not only for the purposes of being able to make those changes within the system, but also kind of looking out for keeping, or I guess retaining individuals with diverse perspectives in the field, and having these kind of places where you know where to go, you know who you can speak to, who shares your interests and perspectives around these topics, because it'll just kind of keep that momentum going.
Thank you all for your incredible insights and realistic a perspective on the endeavor that this is going to be for our field, and also providing concrete actions that researchers can start to take, with the understanding that this is going to be a lot more broad maybe than just the citation that we're adding at the end of the sentence. So I really, really appreciate all of you being here today, sharing your perspectives. It's been really insightful for me. And yeah, thank you so much.